This video is part one of my discussion of Beautiful Boy, an Amazon original film directed by Felix van Groningen in 2018. The film stars Timothée Chalamet and Steve Carell, Maura Tierney, Amy Ryan, among others. The film does tell the story of addiction in a family context. The film is based on two memoirs which came out simultaneously. The first memoir is entitled Beautiful Boy, written by David Sheff, who talks about his own experience of his son's drug addiction. The second book was entitled Tweak, was written by Nick Sheff, and he tells his own story in that memoir of descending into addiction and the difficulties of recovery. According to writer Sam Lansky, who was writing for Time magazine in October of 2018, he states that when you take the two memoirs together, they show the full scope of how drugs affect not only the person with the addiction, but the people they love as well. And he notes that the film, which is directed by the Belgian filmmaker Felix van Groningen, he had the really big challenge of pulling the two narratives together. So you have two memoirs, one from the father's point of view, one from the son's point of view, and the filmmaker had the task of trying to synthesize the two approaches. Now, Lansky, who himself states in his piece on the film that he has his own history of addiction, he argues that even in the media landscape, where we talk as a culture about addiction quite a lot, that addiction remains, quote, misunderstood, sensitive, and cloaked in secrecy, unquote. I would tend to agree. In the article, Timothée Chalamet was interviewed, and he said that one of the things that guided him in his performance was that as a culture we talk about drug abuse still, even at a time when people are more open about their problems with addiction. We still continue to talk about drug addiction and alcohol addiction as a moral failing as opposed to an illness. Chalamet said that for the film and everyone who was involved in it, they hoped that there would be some destigmatizing effect of the movie. Lansky goes on to state that he feels that Beautiful Boy was able to do something that a lot of films and television shows about addiction just don't do well, which was frustrate the audience. And I know that sounds odd, but you may have found yourself while you were watching the film really irritated and frustrated by the repetition of the same cycle over and over, the same arguments again and again. Well, Lansky's perspective is that's how addiction actually is. So one of the complaints that some critics had about Beautiful Boy was that they found it repetitive. And Lansky challenges that and says that's just honest. So I want you to keep that in mind as you watch or as you think back on the film that you've already watched. As Lansky puts it, watching the story unfold gets a little frustrating. He also, he builds on that argument to say that the movie doesn't try to solve the entire country's addiction problems. It's not kind of one of those totally feel-good stories where there's a resolution that is absolutely clear. You leave the film with Nick still in treatment, still very fragile, but still with the support of his family, and in particular his father. And to Lansky, that is an honest picture. You can imagine at the end of the film that this is not the last time that Nick will be in crisis, that he will always struggle, and that he will always have the support and love of his family while he is struggling. So for Lansky, he argues, quote, "That is the reality of addiction." And he goes on to say, "It hit home for me as I watched the film and reflected on my own teenage years." Chalamet was quoted in another piece as saying that he really connected to many of the themes of the movie, where he had friends who struggled with addiction and would cycle in and out of recovery when they were young. And so after having that experience, just as the friend trying to be supportive, he understands both points of view. He also said that he didn't like, based on his own experiences, other films that tend to glorify addiction in this sort of masochistic way, where you have a person whose flaw is either, drinking just a ton of alcohol, or drinking and using drugs, or using drugs as a part of a lifestyle of danger and intrigue, and that's problematic. So we'll come back to that as I unpack some perspectives that I'd like you to consider as you think about the film. Now, the article that I uploaded to D2L for you by Hersey talks about sort of an analysis that they did to look at how American television and film, this article was published in 2005, so, it's got some date to it, but from my perspective, things haven't really changed a great deal since the crop of films that Hersey looked at. There have been some changes, like an increasing number of films which really focus in on opiate addiction. We're seeing that more often, and in some ways fewer films that focus exclusively on alcoholism. But really, thematically, I haven't seen much change since this article was originally published. So what Hersey did was to look at American film and television, and at that time, what Hersey noted was that there was an increasing number of shows and films that were featuring characters who were either in the throes of addiction or who were recovering from addiction. And Hersey argues that these representations tend to feed on one another. They tend to be built on previous representations that are connected to cultural beliefs and values. So one thing to start with is that as we talk about Beautiful Boy, it is addiction, an addiction narrative in an American context. You should recognize that addiction is not characterized in the same way in every cultural context. So the story would be different here versus somewhere in Europe versus somewhere in Asia, for example. Films have a tendency to have a very kind of pat narrative. So when Hersey says a stock experience, there tends to be a narrative that includes either depiction of or discussion of treatment that tends to be very stripped down and simple and not reflective of real life experiences. It tends to be a very upscale version of treatment that is typically just not available to the general public. So that's one of the mistakes. Well, I shouldn't say it's a mistake. That's one of the decisions that was made for Beautiful Boy, because the real life story of the chefs is that they are well-off white people who have access to high-quality inpatient care. Hersey makes the point, and it's a good point, the vast majority of Americans don't have access to that kind of care. They don't have, the insurance, or they don't have the funds on their own to go into a high-end inpatient treatment program with follow-up and aftercare. Most people don't have that kind of access. Even most middle-class people don't have that kind of access. And we'll return to that issue a bit later in the lecture. Hersey also argues that films, because of these things, they do limit our understanding of what addiction is like to a primarily white upper class framework, and that's deeply troubling. And Beautiful Boy is no exception there. It's a compelling story, but it is a story where you have a family of people who are well off, who have privileges that the vast majority of people facing addiction simply don't have. Hersey goes on to argue that the way drug treatment is represented in American culture, that affects us in a lot of ways. So if you watch movies and TV that show people who have addictions going into fairly posh inpatient treatment programs where they're looked after, they're monitored, they're cared for, even if they choose to leave, that sets up the expectation that all people have access to that level of treatment. And therefore, if people don't go to treatment, it may be assumed that they're simply turning their nose up at the opportunity to become sober. So when Hersey talks about this representation of drug treatment in America affecting society, that's one of the stigmatizing messages, is that when people don't get treatment, it's because they don't want to. Many research projects that have, really invested the time to talk to people about their addiction experiences, the overwhelming majority want to stop being addicted. They want to stop the behaviors associated with their addiction, but treatment is unavailable for them. It's out of their reach. There aren't enough facilities. There aren't enough resources for them to do it. And even then, if they got treatment, the sources in their home communities, because you can't go into inpatient treatment and remain employed. So once you come out of treatment, the stresses and reality of everyday life, if that isn't backed up, then your treatment will sometimes fail. So what kind of representations do we often see in these stories? And you'll recognize some of these from Beautiful Boy. In part, the chef's dual memoirs were attractive to filmmakers because they hit some of the notes that are so typical in Hollywood dramas about addiction in the family. So some of the familiar devices that writers of addiction films use is the hitting bottom narrative as a part of the story arc. So clearly in Beautiful Boy, you have Nick ODing, you have Nick in really dire straits. There is that hitting bottom narrative and kind of a message out there that people with addiction really do need to nearly die before they will be convinced that they need to get help. In some of the newer movies, even since this research study was published by Hersey, this trend continues. Characters who are depicted as addicts who are seeking treatment in these newer movies do still tend to be upper middle class or upper class white people. More often male characters than female characters. And that trend has continued. That's been the case since sort of the start of addiction movies and has continued to be true. So lessening the stigma of using substances, of being an addict, still remains kind of elusive. You will have some films that really try to normalize the experience of families who have had addiction kind of rage its way through their family system. That is destigmatizing for some people. It can be very affirming for people who've had the same kind of experience. So when I opened this conversation telling you about Lansky's article, for him, watching Beautiful Boy was a reminder of his own experiences. Now, for other people who have no background in the experience of addiction, they may see a film like Beautiful Boy and be touched by it, but at the same time suspicious of the melodrama, when they're not really connecting to what the real life experiences of families might look like. Now, as I said, and Hersey makes this argument frequently, we do need to challenge this construct of addicts as middle class, upper class white people who are attractive people, who do very unattractive things frequently. We also need to counter the narrative that there's treatment just waiting around every corner, and if you're not taking advantage of it, it's just another sign of your own personal moral failing. That stigma has to be overcome. Addiction treatment services are some of the most underfunded programs in pretty much every state of the United States. There's still this tendency to believe that people with addictions are making a moral choice, and therefore they deserve whatever they get. And part of that is that we criminalize addiction and the behaviors that come with it. We don't just criminalize the actual criminal acts, such as robberies and other kinds of property crimes, and crimes on persons that can happen as a result of drug use and drug addiction, but we criminalize being an addict as well, which is one of the reasons why there's such a high rate of addiction in the prison population right now, is because you can be adjudicated simply because you have an addiction. Now, if you're a person of color and poor, it increases the likelihood astronomically that you will be incarcerated as a result of your addiction as well. And that's not something that is depicted in film, not particularly well, such that the American viewer would recognize the degree to which poverty, or even just being working class, and other intersecting kinds of prejudice could impact the likelihood of a person who has an addiction ending up in prison as a result of that. And as a culture, we still tend to blame people with addictions very directly for their fate, that they've made bad choices, they're bad people, they deserve to be punished for that behavior. And after all, they don't go get treatment when it's just fully available to them, which is a stigma that needs to be overcome. So Hersey challenges us then to really question the normative narrative that we see, and that includes in Beautiful Boy, that treatment is widely available for most people with addictions, even when they have decent jobs. If you don't have good insurance, if you don't have enough money, you cannot go to the kinds of treatment programs that were depicted in the film. You also have the tendency in films, and Hersey argues that this continues a problematic trend that has been present in addiction films, and I would argue it still continues, is that you just don't get a great deal of information to counter some of our improper understandings of addiction and the range of possible treatment approaches that are out there. For example, many films have some kind of depiction of 12-step type programs, which are, run and they function as support and I wouldn't say informal, but treatment provided by non-professionals to help people to remain sober. Treatment will sometimes include, inpatient approaches, but therapy is not typically shown. You might have people in their living circumstances attending group, but not really one-on-ones with actual therapists who are working with people to help them overcome their patterns and habits. And for HERCI, that's very problematic, because if your expectation is, if you or someone you love has an addiction, that you're going to be able to turn them over to a treatment program and they're going to come out of that program sort of mysteriously whole, then you are sorely misguided in terms of what actually happens outside of the Hollywood sphere. On the one hand, there's this overly rosy depiction, but there's also the reverse, the overly fatalistic, that you have treatment programs that are simply designed to be money generators for those who run them, who pull people in who are at their lowest, take loads of cash from them, and really don't do anything to help them achieve long-term sobriety. Those stories are starting to creep in to the television and film landscape. Now, Beautiful Boy kind of hits a middle place here. They don't provide you with much detail about actual treatment. They do give you some information about follow-up care and the 12-step world of having a sponsor and trying to navigate long-term sobriety with the support of other people who have also faced addiction. It also gives you some brief glimpses into Nick's family members, particularly his father and stepmother, who are trying to find the right program for him, and they're running into programs that have bad ratings. So again, you get a little bit of reality, but it's really only the reality for people who are quite privileged. Now, another article, again from that same era, written by Cape, published in 2003, talks about the four major stereotypes that are often seen in films about alcohol and drug use. So Cape was really looking at not addiction per se, but alcohol and drug abuse and use broadly. And I would argue, just like I did with the HERCI piece, that these trends have really not shifted very much at all. And in some cases, I've seen a disturbing trend to show a certain kind of valuing of being hard drinking and hard using of both, alcohol and drugs. I've seen this in particular in sort of the superhero genre, where you have these people who are doing, amazing things. They have these wicked powers, but they're shown, drinking to excess, drinking themselves into blackouts, and using drugs and other chemicals as a double-edged sword to help them cope with what they're going through, but also to sometimes enhance their abilities. In other films that are not in that sort of sci-fi superhero genre, there continue to be characters who are presented, rarely far away from alcohol as an outlet, and that has been sort of an increasing trend. Nevertheless, these four main stereotypes that Cape presents, I believe, are still evident in the current crop of films that we're seeing, in television shows that we're seeing about people who drink and people who use drugs. So one category that Cape identifies is called the tragic hero. motif. There's some really fabulous films from the 90s that fit into this category, where you have a tragic person. Mostly these are male characters who've had difficult lives, and they've turned to drinking or drug use as a part of that difficult life, and it's had just horrible consequences for them. There's also a category of films where you have what Cape calls the demonized user, and in some cases this demonized user is also a murderer. There are many films that fit this group. Obviously this article was written in the early 2000s, so the author is referencing many films from the 80s and 90s as examples. I would argue that there are many examples that we could find from the last 4 or 5 years that would fit this picture, where you have a user that appears not literally necessarily possessed, but is really, just pushed by some sort of evil intent, and simultaneously is using drugs and alcohol. I mentioned earlier the tendency within the superhero / sci-fi genres of having people who are addicts, who are sometimes the hero, sometimes though they're the anti-hero, or they're this really misanthropic person who they're forced, despite their problematic behaviors of drinking too much and using too much, they are forced into almost a pseudo hero role. Sometimes though these characters are just straight up murderers, and occasionally the writers will build in they drink or they use drugs because of the horror of what they're doing. In other cases, they are very clearly presented. If this person wasn't an addict, they wouldn't be doing these horrible things. Now, sometimes you have, in this third group of films, you have the person who uses drugs or alcohol as the rebellious free spirit. So you have someone who's, high on life, they're using, and it opens their perspective. It gives them freedom. It gives them the ability to experience new things at a higher level. Sometimes these films present this rebellious free spirit person as really living that rebellious life, but eventually suffering really negative consequences as a result. But there are some films that simply present this person who uses drugs and alcohol as not really suffering negative consequences for their use. And then in some cases, and I find this really troubling, you have the use for comedy of someone who has an addiction. So you have the falling down drunk cute person. Probably one of the classic examples of this is the 1981 film Arthur, which it's cute for the time period. Today it just seems kind of overly sad and pathetic to use addiction in that way. This is one subgenre that I've seen decrease steadily since the time Cape published this article. I have not seen very many at all films and television shows that really make fun of addicts. And that was in fact what both of the films that Cape references here, what they did. So the drunk person or the high person is used for comic relief. I've seen that a bit with characters who smoke a lot of marijuana, but I have not seen that continue since the 1980s with characters who are alcoholic or characters who have drug addictions. All right, so that's the background that I want you to be thinking about as you think about this film. one of the things that Lansky mentions, and I said this before, that one of the things the film does well is to really push the addiction cycle narrative. And I mentioned before that for many, reviewers, they found the film overly repetitive. And for Lansky, that's the point. Addiction is a cycle of addiction, rehab, recovery, relapse, and that is the real lived experience of many individuals who are facing addiction and the people who love them. And as you can see in the portrayal of both Nick and David by Timothée Chalamet and Steve Carell, that it's infuriating, it's saddening, it's depressing, and it's hard to watch in many ways because of what happens. So in my reflection questions, I asked you, to think about this cycle and what it looks like in the film. And hopefully, you found it frustrating. And if you've never had the experience of knowing someone with an addiction in your own lived experience, I hope you can have more empathy for what it's like as a result of seeing this. So I ask you, how does David react to being told that Nick has left the rehab? And what does he do? He's angry. He's angry that he's been allowed to leave the rehab and not return. And, part of what happens with this addiction, rehab, recovery, relapse cycle is you're talking about an adult who has an addiction, who has rights. So, Nick goes to treatment. He's a grown-up. He's an adult. He's ill, but he's an adult, and he has the right to walk out of rehab. Or if he breaks the rules of a particular rehab, he can be tossed out. And David's reaction is a classic parental reaction. You're doing whatever you think you can to get your loved one the treatment that they need. And even though Nick is an adult, he's still a vulnerable child from the point of view of the father and the mother, that they are terrified and angry and horrified that they're not going to be able to help him. One of the biggest nightmares for parents of an adult child with an addiction is that they will die as a result of their addiction, and that they won't be able to save them. They won't be able to protect them. Now, the film also gives you a way of thinking about the cultural shame and stigma that remains associated with addiction in film and television, which reflects the shame and stigma that we still have in our cultural context. Now, for most of you, you're in your early 20s. You have really never known a time during which we haven't had a quote-unquote opiate crisis going on. And by saying quote-unquote, I don't mean that I'm belittling it. I mean, we call it the opiate crisis. So this conversation about addiction has been a part of your lives pretty much from the point in time you became, conscious of the world around you. Still, though, there's intense shame and stigma that's associated with having a family member who has an addiction. There's a tendency to reject not just the person with the addiction, but to reject the entire family. There's also a tendency to blame the parents as a cause of the addiction. And part of what's happening there is that as a culture, we tend to have this narrative that people become addicted because they've been traumatized because someone has harmed them, because someone has neglected them. And, the reality is that, yes, substance abuse can happen as a response to trauma, but it's not necessary. It is not required. Many of you read the first person narrative, Chasing the High. And the author of that narrative, talks about the same thing, that he may have had some sense of himself as an outcast, of not being popular, but he had a good life. He had a good family. He had more than he could ask for, and he still found his way into addiction, very serious and severe addiction. So one of the reasons that David doesn't want Karen to talk to other people about the addiction, about the treatment, is that he has, like most of us, been raised in a culture where addiction is shameful. And that's sad and inappropriate, because it's one of the things that stops people from seeking out the help that is in fact available to them in their local communities. And it also stops the family members from getting the support and help that they might need as well. Now, one thing that Lansky noted that the film does particularly well is kind of take you back in time to allow you to experience some glimpses of the childhood Nick. And I would argue that it's helpful if we're going to look at films about addiction, it's helpful to have a broader context for understanding who this human being is, who now is in this desperate kind of situation of being addicted to meth or opiates or alcohol. You can get really kind of tangled up in the person's current state and miss the fact that they were once a child, that they grew up in a home, that they had experiences, and so on. So the filmmaker is trying to use some of these kind of flashback stories that, they're rooted in the narratives that David and Nick Sheff in real life wrote. They want to humanize and give fuller context to both the dad and the son as whole people. So you're given the fact that Nick's parents are divorced, that they sometimes argue with each other, that there were these family things, but that he was, loved and valued, and was a loving and involved sibling to the younger kids in his family. I'm going to pause there and call that the end of part one. We'll return and start to talk about the other elements of the film, including some of the information you're given about comorbid conditions.